Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Tips Forum. We're very happy to have you all, and hopefully this morning goes smoothly. So my name is Lesego, and I am an economist at Tips. And today we have an exciting day ahead of us, slightly shorter than yesterday, so we can all go home early. So this morning we have 3 sessions plus 1 plenary session. And we have a panel discussion from 12:30 until 1:30. And the panel discussion promises to provide reflections and insights that will contribute to a deeper understanding of the implications of the global structural shift and its implications on industrial policy. So in this session, I'd like to hand over to Cornelius Dube from Zimbabwe, who will be facilitating this session. And today's first session is on the reshaping of global value chains in manufacturing. Cornelius, over to you. Thanks.
Good morning once again to everyone. I hope we have all enjoyed our stay in the nice city of Joburg. Today we are just continuing from where we left and hoping that technology is also not continuing from where it left yesterday. Okay, so in this morning session, we are going to have 4 presentations that we are going to hear. 3 of them are going to be made physically. The guys are already here, ready for you. And one of the presenters is online. As has already been mentioned, we are talking about the reshaping of global value chains in manufacturing. I'm sure from the presentations, we are going to hear more insights as to how we can, as Africa, as Southern Africa, we can also prepare to tap in and do the reshaping global value chains, especially in manufacturing, which is mostly going down in terms of contribution to GDP in most of the countries. Okay, so our first presentation is going to come from Odwa Mtati, and as you can see from your program, he's going to talk about SME manufacturing decline in South Africa, giving us some lessons which other developing countries can tap into. Okay, so this presentation is going to be 15 minutes. So for the next 15 minutes, we're going to hear about this. And then if you look into the booklets that have been shared with you, you're going to see our bios. I'm not going to be reading out his bio, but while he's preparing his presentation, you can all take a look and read his biography. I'm sure the team that is in front of you here is adequately capacitated and adequately knowledgeable to be presenting on the topics that they've been assigned. So without much further ado, over to you, sir.
Good morning. Thank you very much. If I trip, it is because I did not take my nerve calming tablets this morning. So let me get into it. I have my colleague online who will take the very difficult questions. I'll take the easy ones. So in the introduction, we talk about the fact that in the National Development Plan and in the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, industrialization and small and medium-sized enterprises are regarded as key channels for driving economic and socio-economic development in South Africa. We highlight this point, it would be much clearer why we emphasize the point. This study therefore examines the following questions. 1, what factors contributed to the decline in the manufacturing contribution in South Africa? The second one is, have any countries of broadly similar population and development status achieved notable success in growing their small business manufacturing sectors? The third one is that, can any difference be determined between policies, strategies, and implementation of those countries and the approach followed by South Africa. We had a hypothesis. The hypothesis was that the contribution of manufacturing to growth was in decline amongst SMEs, as we all know in the broader economy. This assumption was based on the general pattern in the decline of the percentage contribution of manufacturing to GDP. The decline in employment by manufacturing small enterprises suggested by employment statistics and a long-standing body of literature alluding to the negative outlook for manufacturing in the country. So our hypothesis was that the performance of SMEs mirrors that of the decline in manufacturing. The evidence suggests that whilst the hypothesis is correct in respect of the employment contribution, wherein it pointedly shows a decline in employment within manufacturing in SMEs, it is not correct regarding their contribution to output. It's a contradiction. This appears most notable from the long-term growth trend in SME turnover and in a rising percentage of manufacturing SMEs turnover, as well as from the evidence of investment in manufacturing firms above the SME scale during the period 2018-19. The regression analysis of drivers appearing from literature supported by expectations regarding the promotion of manufacturing by SMEs, except for higher importing activity during correlated positive with higher SME turnover. So let's talk about the policies and the strategies to support the status of manufacturing in the country. There have been continued efforts which can be seen from the IPEBs from 2007 to 2018, which focused on the following: the prioritization of high potential sectors for comprehensive support, the promotion of localization, including targeted funding measures and designation for local content, and the alignment or the effort at alignment of BE measures binding on the private sector with government preferential procurement. But all of us know some of these difficulties, that whilst there might be a policy, but in respect of implementation, there could be challenges. We have seen National Treasury being taken to court, issues of BBBE measures. The National Development Plans placed before us ambitious targets to reduce unemployment from 25% in 2011 and 33% in Q1 of 2023. There was an expectation of 11 million jobs to be created, in which 90% were supposed to be created by small businesses. There was a promotion of mass entrepreneurship, a focus on regulatory reform, improved support services, and an improved access to domestic and export markets to empower SME contribution to the target. So we reiterate the point that there's been a particular focus on the promotion of manufacturing for export features a significant element of the NDP growth strategy. The recovery plan also mandates a focused program to build support for SME participation in the manufacturing value chain for purposes of localization. The focus areas are manufacturing by township and rural enterprises, SME production of light and fast consumer goods, involvement of SMEs in mineral beneficiation, and the revival of dormant production infrastructure. We've seen it in some areas with some measure of success in others, and not in all. So if we consider the current contribution of the manufacturing sector and the extent of SME participation, we consulted quite a number of public published sources from the period 2008 to 2022. The South African Reserve Bank statistics indicate that the real value add reached a high point of approximately 573 billion in 2008. This was shortly before the global economic crisis. The performance normalized by 2013, but later adopted a stable trend thereafter. The performance approached that of 2008 in 2018 and in early 2019, of course, then affected by COVID. And in Q1 of 2022, it reached a high point of 545 billion, wherein it is now stuck to that. The contribution of manufacturing overall, according to Stats SA figures, indicates that the annualized manufacturing value add at constant prices declined from 30% in 2011 to 11.3% in 2022. So the graph seeks to illustrate that. So the following two figures seek to show trends in SME manufacturing turnover for the period 2008 to 2022. The upward trend in turnover is observed, which is an indication of increased production and demand for manufactured products from SMEs. The contribution of SME manufacturing turnover to the total has grown from below 40% in the first quarter of 2008 to 53% in the fourth quarter of 2022. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor South Africa report also highlighted that entrepreneurship activity in the manufacturing sector has been growing, especially during the period 2015 to 2019. It should be noted, though, that the turnover of small businesses is larger than that of medium businesses. In the working paper, there's a reference to why the distinction between the small and the medium businesses. So these are graphic representations of the output in respect of SMEs. The employment, the criteria of fewer than 50 employees was considered acceptable. So that's the measure that was utilized to represent the SME group of most interest from a developmental perspective. The OECD has previously found that small establishments with fewer than 100 employees account for about between 40 to 80% of manufacturing employment internationally, with a higher net job creation rates in the smaller classes. The figure is based on the Stats SA data from Q1 of 2008 to Q4 2022 that shows that South Africa did not follow this pattern for a period of approximately 11 years between 2010 and 2011. The data reflected on this figure is from Stats SA, the Q1 2008 to Q4 2022 suggests that employment in manufacturing, my apologies, I work in the oceans economy, so I always want to jump in there, which is not the case now. With a fewer than 50 employees, declined from an annual average of approximately 1.16 million in 2008 to an average of 733,000 in 2000, or by percentage, 37%. The largest part of the loss for the smaller enterprises was sustained between 2008 and 2013, corresponding with the recovery period, 2008-2009 financial crisis, with a below 800,000 and never exceeding that level since that particular period. So the emphasis here is the decline in employment. So whilst the output might have gone up, but the actual statistics show that there's a decline in employment within that particular period. Now, we had worked on the top 10 manufacturing industries for SME, employing less than 50 people by employment for the period 2008 versus 2022. Now, the industry, so the first block refers to the industry itself, the average of employment in 2008 compared to the average of employment in 2022. So those industries include the manufacture of wearing apparel, the manufacture of other fabricated metal products, metalworks, service activities, the manufacture of products of wood, cork, straw, and plating material, the manufacture of non-metallic mineral products, the manufacture of structured metal products, the manufacture of basic iron and steel, other chemical products, beverages, and manufacture of other food products, the printing and services activities that are related to printing. All but one of these identified thanks for the caution, I feel harassed. All but one of the 10 leading industries employed fewer workers in 2010 than in 2008. The exception was the manufacture of other food products. Apologies, colleagues, let me try and catch up on time. There are quite a number of other slides. So the literature review that we used included the CEDA SME quarterly update for Q3 of 2017, which accounted for about 24% of the SME turnover as per that particular code. So manufacturing-led productivity in the secondary sector of the overall economy. So although these factors support economic development perspective, a trend was recognized towards deindustrialization. The contributing factors were the uncertainty as an aftermath of the global financial crisis, domestic economic policy uncertainty, the industrial constraint with electricity featuring high, the labor market instability, the stagnation in one of the biggest sectors in the country, which is mining, and the loss of competitiveness due to rising labor costs. We also refer to literature published by the manufacturing circle, which interesting, although it raised issues in 2012, some of those issues still stand in 2023, which is of interest, which is increases in administrative prices such as electricity and fuel, the cost of imported components, the competition from lower priced imports backed by industry subsidies from countries of origin, the protectionist trade practices in key export markets, and then the labor laws and regulations that affect SMEs, although they are not designed for SMEs. Let me jump some of these. So parts of what is attributed to the issue of the lack of growth in respect of this is a finance. So this slide specifically refers to the lack of access to finance as a great inhibitor for SME. So the results are lack of access to finance is negatively related to SME manufacturing output, which is in line with the theoretical expectations. One of the other authors highlighted the access to finance, that once people have access, it promotes their contribution. Because on the other hand, it contributes to the high failure rate. We then did a comparison with 3 countries. One is Malaysia, with a population of 34 million in 2021, Vietnam with a population of 97 million in 2021, and the Philippines with with a population of 113 million. We'll see the GDP contribution in each of those. So in Vietnam, manufacturing contributed approximately 24.8 in 2022, rising from 18.6. So the bottom points seek to elaborate on that. In Vietnam, the government adopted a resolution setting out their national development plan to 2045 with a particular focus on support measures for SMEs and specifically domestic industrial enterprises. The contribution of SMEs in Malaysia are contributed to 24.5% in 2022 and remained unchanged since 2008. And between these years, a decline was noted. In Malaysia, they also adopted measures that focus on SMEs in manufacturing with higher level participation in value chains, modernization and digitalization of operations, adoption of technology in product development, strengthening of entrepreneurs' financial capability, their participation in the procurement and initiatives to increase demand and connection to suppliers. The Philippines is their contribution was 17% of the GDP in 2022. So that's the comparison with their strategies. There's a reference to those as well. So the recommendations is greater inclusion of SMEs in value chain of large businesses and the promotion of greater cooperation between large and small businesses. Now, the policies speak to these, but it is at the point of execution that you do not find much of this happening. So in view of South Africa's current high unemployment rate, the macro level development emerging from the countries may be of great interest that we may seek to compare ourselves and learn from their practices. We are of the contention that the comprehensive support model adopted by SETA in the late 2010, which speaks about the introduction of small enterprise manufacturing support program, now taken over by the Department of Small Business Development, is critical in this regard. So we then conclude with the limitations of this study by saying that we needed to rely on turnover as an indicator of the SME output. And we then speak to what are the disadvantages of such. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think what I can only urge the remaining presenters, of course, I can only urge. Otherwise, I don't want to harass anyone. I can only urge that let us stick to the time that was allocated, because I'm sure if we don't have much time in terms of the tight program that we have. I'm sure you all have questions for. I suggest that let's just park those questions for a while, and then we'll fire as soon as the presentations are done. Okay, so we can proceed to the next presentation. I had actually not introduced myself. I wanted to do it at the end, so that after I've done a good job, but it looks like I'm failing already. So please can also try to help me here maintain the time that has been allocated to me, because if we encroach into the tea break, it's the moderator who has failed, and I will not introduce myself. Okay, so the next presentation is from Mohau, right? Yes, I will not make even an attempt to pronounce the surname. I will not make an attempt because I will not be able to do that. The topic is quite interesting. How not to industrialize? Question mark. Industrialization without energy cannot be good for economic growth and employment creation. Over to you, sir. I'm sure we are going to be hearing something very interesting here. I urge. Yes, I'm just urging you to stick to the 15 minutes time slot. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Knowing me, I probably would exceed the 15 minutes. So apologies in advance. Yes, when I saw the tips forum and the theme for the year, I was interested, and I felt like I needed to also understand how not to industrialize. Working in a province where we virtually have a 2% manufacturing sector, I just needed to have a highlight or an overview of what it takes or what could be looked at in terms of how to industrialize. And off the bat, this is an exploratory research. It's a work in progress. So inputs will be gladly accepted. At this regard, 2020, we had a COVID pandemic that hit the world. And soon after that, we tried to find our feet. The global economy was struck by I tend to call it the Russo-Ukrainian impasse. I know other colleagues would prefer to call it conflict or war. For me, but it's still an impasse. I feel that it's something that could be managed. So the Russian-Ukrainian impasse has led to a global economic stalemate. And in this regard, West imposing sanctions on Russia, however, to their own detriment to an extent, as these sanctions meted against Russia had spelled a reduction in the exports of energy, which in turn have elevated and ultimately led to higher inflation. And obviously, in all likelihood going forward, this will be perpetuated. And looking at the critical nature of energy, and more so in manufacturing, I looked at the study of Adhikari and Chen, and they cited that energy is a critical contributor to global economy. That was their take, and this is from an analysis of 4 decades back, not even in this day. And fast tracking it to the South African perspective, load shedding is seen as detrimental to the South African economy and could potentially thwart our developmental aspirations as a country. And like the previous speaker, Mr. Odwa, talked to the SMMEs, frequent load shedding is an impediment to conducting business in South Africa at the moment. And just to illuminate this point, the Council for Scientific Industrial Research estimated that the cost to the South African economy could be around 560 billion. that load shedding cost the country in 2020. And they furthermore went and said this the 2022 was the most intensive load shedding we've experienced in the country. And this is not a Mohau from working in Kimberley. No, it's the CSIR. Naturally, we would want to understand the literature in terms of manufacturing. And the fathers of development economics, Yocaldo, tend to be accorded the honor of being one of the finest scholars of development. And his earlier work attempted to understand the impact of manufacturing sector on growth. So as we are mulling over the fact that we need to have growth, but as a country, South Africa, that is, we are in a way curtailing our own economic growth ambitions. I also looked at the study by Bukosi. She did a panel analysis on about 6 SADC countries. And in his study, I believe, yeah, because it's Fenwell, so I believe it's a he. Acceded to the fact that faster growth in manufacturing output and productivity is often associated with GDP growth. And this fact, he then says, which leads to the increase in demand for manufactured goods, leading to increased levels of investments and thus exports. And I tend to base my sort of this exploratory work on the work of Bukosi. Apologies for the spelling there. Industrialization remains one of the key tools to transform the economic landscape in Southern Africa. That's a fact. And one of our keynote speakers, Stark, stated early in 2014 that the role of manufacturing in South Africa's economic development process should not be ignored. And if we do ignore it, it will be at our own peril. So seated here and going through the presentation, we should be mindful that we need the manufacturing sector going forward. Like I earlier alluded to the fact that it's still continuing. There is a Russia-Ukrainian impasse. And given the significance of Russia's commodity or resource based economy, it impacted on the global economy. We saw an upsurge in the coal index, or the price of coals in that regard. Most of us seated here would remember that Richards Bay experienced high volumes of coal exportation. And even, I believe, the National Treasury cited the fact that there was an increase in revenue generation through the increase or the exportation of coal. So it did benefit the country, but globally, it is a pressing point. If we are talking energy, where do we find this energy? And for me, this was an interesting slide, I would say, given the fact that we want to decarbonize. However, according to the statistical review of World Energy, this is the latest, I think it is not even a month old, this report. They said that fossil fuels still accounts for about 82% of primary energy used globally. And as South Africa is still largely dependent on coal for energy. Yes, we want to decarbonize, but we are still heavily reliant on coal for energy generation. However, China is the biggest consumer of coal globally. Yes, the figures, you'll find that they are just below 60% in terms of their reliance, but in terms of the quantity, the quantum, they tend to be higher in comparison to other regions like ourselves. This is a South African perspective. This is from CSIR, and they were talking through the intensiveness of the load shedding that we experienced in 2022. And they said we had over 3,773 hours of load shedding. This is just 2022. It's no other year. And furthermore, they alluded to the fact that the energy availability factor is declining. And there are estimations in terms of the hourly energy availability factor. In 2020, during the economic lockdown, precipitated obviously by COVID-19, there was a contraction in the global manufacturing purchasing index. However, there seemed to be a shift or an expansion. And this is a slide, this was taken from the National Treasury's budget review that was released earlier this year. So there is a gravitation to expand the manufacturing, or the business of manufacturing, if I were to call it that. Yeah, I was just reminded yesterday watching the news. Apologies, I have a bit of the purchasing managers index for South Africa in a previous quarter decline. So we are in a way in a bit of a contractionary period as a country. But globally, there has been for that period between the fourth quarter of 2020 and the second quarter of 2022, there has been a expansionary. Now, for the basis of our study, I tended to look at 5 countries. These countries, for me, I call them the old guard versus the new guard. The old guard will be your UK, as well as your Germany, whilst the new guard will be South Africa, Brazil, as well as India. I think it was Nishal yesterday in his presentation, he avoided including China in his analysis. I also have to confess, I also avoided including China because of the distortion that it would have had in terms of my data. So in all these 5 countries, there has been a general decline in the percentage of contribution by manufacturing. If you were to look back in 1990, you'd find that manufacturing accounted for, in most instances, over 20% of their economies. However, the majority now are between 10 and 15%, which is like literally 10% decline over time. So there's a general decline in I'll call it the efficacy of manufacturing in terms of the GDP contribution. And this slowdown or the general decline could also be studied using the levels of capability and the rate of industrialization that was proposed by Danny Roderick in his earlier work in 2013. And you'd find that because there's a variation of capabilities between the old guard as well as the new guard, you find that with a country like Germany, there has been some rapid and sustained growth, whilst for others, there hasn't been that. It has been more episodic. In the country's perspective, in South Africa, our NDP proposes that we should look at labor-intensive manufacturing, as it proposes that it's good for growth, as well as good for also employment. So South Africa, for all accounts, has one of the highest unemployment rates, be it for in total or in terms of the youth. This is just the industrial think tank, how they conceptualize the South African manufacturing. Thus, for the sake of this session, as well as the work that I sort of am exploring, I looked at the wise growth of manufacturing sector and electricity provision irresponsive, and try to also find the long run as well as the short run relationship between the growth of manufacturing sector as well as the electricity provision. Also, I attempted to also look at the causality or directions of causality, and for what could be the probable causes, or what we often term as people in economic development binding constraints undermining the industrialization trajectory that we seek to achieve. For obvious reasons, and for limitations, I used a panel data analysis to have an idea of what is happening out there. This is our economic model for the analysis as manufacturing with electricity provision, GDP growth, investment. And I also notably included unemployment because I feel that it could be a binding constraint to the growth of manufacturing. This just highlights how the growth has been in terms of the 5 countries of interest. Number 1 will be your Brazil. Number 2 would be your Germany. The third one will be India. The fourth one will be South Africa, which has seen more of an oscillation. And fifth would be the United Kingdom. They are actually in alphabetical order in a way. As expected, one has to also test for stationarity, and it was evident for all variables except for the investment growth that all variables are stationary. And also in terms of correct integration test, we also did the Western Pedroni test as well as the cow test, and they sort of fitted and suggesting that there is a long run co-integrated relationship amongst the variables in the panel. I then used the fixed effect panel data regression. And for me, it was sort of startling that the provision of electricity has a positive relationship with the manufacturing growth. However, what was elevated was the fact that GDP growth has an even higher effect on the growth of manufacturing. So in essence, what it says is, or what it suggests is that you need heightened growth for you to have a heightened manufacturing growth. So if you want to have your manufacturing sector expanding, you should also be mindful that growth is critical in terms of the broader economy. However, what was also startling was the fact that investment was not coming to the party, whether it was in terms of theoretical expectation that it will propel the growth the sector's growth, as well as the statistical significance test. It failed on both, meaning that it's not as effective. And in this slide, I'm actually using the first table. It's actually 2 tables. The first table is the normal, or just a fixed effect, and then the bottom one is the robust. I also proceeded to use the random effect regression, and it also gave similar results, that a electricity provision does meet the theoretical expectation, but however, it failed the theoretical, oh, no, apologies. It failed the statistical significance test. So meaning one tends to be nitpicky in terms of whether to utilize or not. What else? Also, in this slide, we see that the growth of the economy is significant to the sector's growth, that is manufacturing sector's growth. And after performing the two tests, the fixed effect test as well as the random effect test, I, for obvious reasons, did a houseman test to determine which one to proceed to in terms of the model. And fortunately or unfortunately, the random effect stole the show. But then, based on the work of it was Ingilesi Lots as well as Setlapelo, they did an analysis on the consumption of electricity for all the 9 provinces across the country. They tended to use a pool mean group. As such, as I also explored the use of the pool mean group in terms of to understand both the short run as well as the long run effect. In terms of the short run, electricity meets the theoretical expectation. However, it does fail the statistical expectation. And also, GDP is also good still for both the short run as well as the long run for the manufacturing sector. Still have 5 minutes. Oh, was it? It's actually 7. Oh, I must wrap up. Oh, but I didn't see them. But it's okay. For obvious reasons, when you're trying to analyze this, you want to also look at the country's perspective. And for South Africa, apologies if I cannot see it on the screen. I definitely know that you guys cannot necessarily see the figures, and apologies for that. But we see, if we look, we zoom in the South African perspective, that indeed electricity provision is critical to the growth of manufacturing. Unlike in the panel data analysis, this is when we are zooming in on a country specific. So we do know that the sector could potentially lead to about a 2% growth for the electricity provision could lead to about 2% growth of the manufacturing. So if we were to put a policy position, we should be saying to those in power that we need electricity provision to sustain our manufacturing sector. And fortunately, the data also does allude to that fact. This is just my concluding slide. And I actually like the Zalk statement that the role of manufacturing in South Africa's economic process should not be ignored. And whilst we're talking industrialization, we should also be coupling it with the provision of energy to make sure that we can sustain the economy. Thank you. And apologies for the silences.
Okay, thank you very much. And the apologies that we had to present when we were struggling with your sinus, but that is part of the work. Huh? Okay, so allow me to adjust the program a little bit and start with Vuyiswa. Instead of we also have another presenter, but they are online. And given the experiences of yesterday, I would rather we finish with physical presentation first. And if there's any glitch online, people can take that opportunity to ask questions to those that are physically present. So let's have one more presentation from Vuyiswa, and then we can go online and try to see if today is any better than yesterday. Okay, up to you. Thank you. Hopefully you are going to help me this time.
I will try. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'll try to stick to time. I must admit I'm also not great at that, but I will try to be the one that, gets us through the session. So today's session, I will be talking about South African retailers' sourcing strategies and how they've shifted from offshoring to nearshoring and more recently reshoring of production. So the outline of the presentation is that I'll take you through the context and the motivation and the analysis for the study, with the disclaimer that this study is based on my master's dissertation, so it's still a work in progress, but I think it does provide some insights in terms of the industrial policy processes that have been undertaken, and how we can look at those processes and learn from them and what type of adjustments are required. I will talk through the profile of the South African retailers that we've looked at. As I said, there are 3 observations that we see. The observations are retailer sourcing strategies in terms of offshoring production and the implications. I'll also discuss the nearshoring strategies as well as the reshoring strategies and the implications for the manufacturing sector locally and within Southern Africa. And then lastly, I'll conclude with the policy considerations. So as I've said, this study is a work in progress. It's part of my master's dissertation. We examine the retailer sourcing strategies and how they've changed between 1995 through to 2001. The study analyzes the drivers and the trends influencing 5 retailers' sourcing strategies. Those retailers include Pepkor, the Foschini Group, Woolworths Holding, Mr. Price, and Truworths International. We've conducted the study through interviews with retailers, specific interviews with 2 retailers and industry actors, including industry associations and policymakers. And then we've also done a deep dive in terms of a literature review of the performance of the textile and apparel sector, and also understanding retailer sourcing strategies in terms of their company reports and their websites, news articles, that type of those types of sources, and then a historical analysis of South Africa's trade and industrial policy as it relates to the clothing and textile sector. And the reason for the study was based on an understanding or trying to actually explore retailers' relationships with their suppliers, their governance structures, and understanding the power dynamics between retailers and their suppliers, and also understanding that there is limited empirical studies on South African apparel retailers. Specifically, there's a lot of research that's been done looking at retailers from the north, so especially from the UK, from the US, and their sourcing strategies and the implications of suppliers actually integrating into global value chains. So the focus of the study really is to understand the implications of sourcing strategies from retailers based in the global south. So in South Africa, the South African retail sector is well established with local retail groups with apparel stores in South Africa and across other countries. I just want to give a quick profile of the retailers that we looked at. Most of the retailers that we've looked at have been operating in South Africa for quite a while. Majority of them, 4 of them out of the 5, have been in operation for over 91 years in South Africa, with the exception of Mr. Price, which is a relatively newcomer. It's been operating for 37 years. And the retailers cater to various customers ranging from middle to high income customers, and they sell their own private labels as well as third-party labels. And the retailers have stores in South Africa, in Southern Africa, in Namibia, Eswatini, Lesotho, even Kenya. And then also some retailers have stores in the UK and in Australia. just to bear in mind that these retailers or retail groups, so they have apparel divisions, but also cater to other divisions, for example, Mr. Price Home, and sports division. So they don't just focus on apparel. But what we find is that in 2021, 2022 financial year, the clothing segment of the retailers turnover accounted for 15 to 55% of retailers' turnover. And I just want to take some time to kind of look at this diagram. This is a smile curve. It shows the value-added activities within the textile and apparel value chain. And traditionally, historically, retailers, both domestically and global retailers, have actually focused on the pre-production aspects and the pre-production aspects. Those are the activities they traditionally focus on. Those activities are intangible. They have the highest value, and they capture the highest price or returns. And the retailers outsource most of their production to low-cost regions. But as we'll see, as I discussed, this smile curve in terms of who captures what value is starting. So just to go straight into the observations of our study. So the first observation is that between 1995 to 2010, retailer sourcing strategies increasingly moved towards sourcing from low cost countries. So there are a number of factors that have contributed to this. This has been a very interesting interesting period in South Africa's history in terms of the clothing and textile sector. So the first major shift that happened in terms of retailer sourcing strategies was the trade liberalization. So it's a twofold impact, whereby we had trade liberalization, which resulted in retailers having access to cheaper imports, a variety of different products. So retailers shifted their sourcing from local suppliers to offshore because of that. And then at the same time, China joined the World Trade Organization. And at that time, China became a significant player in terms of apparel and textile production. And then, as I had mentioned before, the influence to offshore was the availability of a wide range of products, fabrics, different styles of products, as well as at the quality and at the delivery timelines that the retailers wanted. So as I've said before, it's not a conundrum per se, but the impact of trade liberalization and policies also were to a point where the government was shifting their trade policy, but also the industrial policy from import substitution and protecting the local manufacturers to exports-orientated industrialization. With this exports-orientated industrialization, manufacturers were encouraged to export. There were a number of initiatives that were undertaken to encourage export. There was the duty customs certificate system scheme that was implemented, as well as the imports rebates on fabrics that encouraged manufacturers to source fabrics from outside of the country, but also they would get a rebate if they actually produce products that are exported. And then also manufacturers had the opportunity to export to the US through AGOA. And buyers from the US actually saw South Africa as a potential source market because of the costs but unfortunately because of South Africa's limited, or the industry's limited capabilities in terms of economies of scale, not being able to produce products at the right quality, and also the lack of fabric availability within the country, a lot of the retailers, US retailers, stopped ordering products from South African manufacturers, which was, and at that time also the manufacturers themselves diverted from supplying local manufacturers to local retailers to supplying international retailers. So there were a couple of implications. So when I talk about the implications, these implications are implications in terms of the retailers' business models, as well as the implications for the South African manufacturing sector. So the retailers, through offshoring, they took the time to improve their importing capabilities. They even set up offices in China so that they can have closer access to the suppliers. They sourced a large scale of imports from China. I think between 1996 to 2008, there was quite a big shift in terms of the amount that was sourced from China, jumping from 16% to 60%. And then South African retailers did very little to support local manufacturers and did not invest in upgrading suppliers' capabilities. The one interesting thing about this period in time is that because of trade liberalization, retailers had access to cheaper imports. So they diverted demand from local production. And because of that, manufacturers then didn't have enough orders. So there were job losses, there were factory closures, and there was a lack of reinvestment into productive capabilities, which was a spiraling kind of down cycle, whereby they lost more competitiveness because of the lack of investment, because of the lack of demand from local retailers. And also apparel manufacturers, as a response to this, because they couldn't compete with cheap imports, as a response, they relocated production to non-metro areas to take advantage of low wages. And what also happened at this time is that there was an acknowledgement and tensions within between the different stakeholders within the value chain, and these tensions were really around around China's cheap imports into the country and how they are compromising local production, to the point where in 2007, 2008, the government implemented some quotas. This was a 2-year program, or 2-year incentive, or 2-year imperative, where governments where governments applied a quota against Chinese imports. But at this point, the retailers adjusted their sourcing strategies and sourced from other regions such as Bangladesh, Vietnam. So we didn't really see a decrease in imports. We just saw retailers diverting their sourcing to other regions, and it didn't really help in terms of increasing the retailers' manufacturers' competitiveness, because these trade policies were not paired with policies that actually assisted manufacturers to become more competitive. So as you can see here, this graph just illustrates basically the trade profile in terms of exports and imports of clothing and textile, and you can see the how much we actually import. It's been growing in terms of the import profile, with South Africa really not exporting quite a lot. So then the second observation that we have is that, as I've said, retailers improved their importing capabilities and diverted sourcing, not just offshore, but they also diverted sourcing to closer to home, so to regional suppliers. There are a number of reasons for this. One being the preferential trade agreements. So SADC and the SACU trade agreements made it easier for producers in countries such as Mauritius, Eswatini, Lesotho to actually export to South Africa. But also an interesting development, and if you look at these countries, they also were part of AGOA, and part of AGOA was a trade agreements or preferential trade agreements with some African countries based on some products, including textile and apparel. So US buyers would actually source from neighboring countries, Eswatini, Mauritius, and because of the high standards and the high demands that they placed on their suppliers, these suppliers have been able to build up capabilities. So South African retailers have also been able to take advantage of the capabilities that have been built through other preferential trade agreements that these countries have had. Another factor that has influenced retailer sourcing strategy is the shift towards a quick response model. I'll discuss this model a bit later on because it's also observed in observation 3. And then more recently, suppliers, retailers have focused on diversifying their supply chains as well as consolidating their supply chains, which I'll also elaborate on a bit later on. And then as I've said before, retailers have a presence across Southern Africa in terms of their outlets, in terms of their stores. So retailers are looking at expanding their stores. And there've been a couple of discussions that retailers have had with governments in the countries in which they operate in, and discussions related to the fact that, you know, it's one thing to just export to the region, but what type of development will retailers actually play in terms of sourcing locally from those suppliers? And then retailers are starting to look at the center of excellence as Mauritius, Madagascar, and Morocco and Egypt as potential sourcing regions. So this graph basically just shows the change in sourcing from regions. As you can see, the light blue at the bottom, that is sourcing from East Asia, which plateaued between 2015 and 2019. And then, as you can see with the darker blue, that's sourcing from Southern Africa, and that's been on a steady increase. And then this slide also just kind of emphasizes this change in terms of inter-regional trade and regional value chains that have been developed in Southern Africa. I won't discuss it in great detail, but it basically showcases that for Eswatini, for example, they've actually been diverting their exports more to South Africa than to the EU or the US. And then the third observation that we have is the not more recent, but from 2010 to date, retailers have been placed at the center of industrial policy that's focused on more sector-specific industrial policy, which is the retail, clothing, textile, footwear, and leather master plan. And retailers through this master plan have committed to increase local sourcing up to 65% by 2030. There are other commitments that have been made in the master plan. I think there are 6 to 7 pillars. Local sourcing is one of them. There are a number of reasons that retailers have decided to source locally. There's been an industrial policy shift. So from 2010, the government has been more, let's say, intentional in terms of the industrial policy that has been, or incentives that have been developed for the sector. Before in the mid 90s to the early 2000s, I think it was more reactive. So the industrial policy that has been developed, if we look in 2010, there was the clothing and textile competitiveness program that was developed, which included incentives to increase competitiveness, as well as production capabilities in terms of machinery and capital equipment. And then more recently, as I've said, there's the master plan, which looks at increasing local demand and local demand, as well as local sourcing. And then we've got the quick response model. And this quick response model basically means that retailers want the ability to be able to respond quickly to customers' needs. So if certain products are demanded, certain products are in higher demand, retailers want to be able to source those products more quickly, reduce the lead times that it takes to actually source those products. So that requires that retailers have access to suppliers closer to the home markets. So because this, retailers are looking to source more locally. And then because of supply chain disruptions, not just from COVID, but before COVID with the financial crisis, retailers have been looking at diversifying their supply chain to mitigate against supply chain risks and uncertainty. And then also retailers have been looking at consolidating and working with more strategic suppliers and building stronger relationships rather than arm's length relationships with their suppliers. And then in terms of just global trends that retailers have been focusing on, there's a big shift in terms of sustainability and ethical sourcing and traceability. Retailers want to have greater control over their supply chains, greater understanding in terms of the processes that their suppliers undertake in terms of sustainable processes, as well as producing products that are more sustainable. And then lastly, another global trend that has been highlighted in retailers' sourcing strategies has been the deployment of digital. Thank you. Management tools and the development of omni-channel platforms, which are platforms, online platforms. So if you look at look at this graph just basically shows the retailer's local sourcing strategy. So you can see that Truworths has quite a high sourcing strategy locally, around 45%, and PEP is sitting at around 28% in 2021. Okay, so retailers, in terms of sourcing locally, retailers have begun to participate more actively in clusters. So as I've said, there was the clothing and textile competitiveness program, and from that program, clusters were developed. These are private-public partnerships between retailers, local municipalities, and their manufacturers. And these clusters provide certain programs that help manufacturers link into retailers' value chains, and also assist manufacturers in terms of upgrading their facilities, or in terms of competitiveness processes. And retailers, like I've said, are developing a quick response model, and they're developing this response model in different ways. The different retailers that we've looked at have different types of strategies that have applied. So there's some commonalities, but there are a lot of there's some similarities, but there are also a lot of differences in terms of the approaches that they've taken. But the two distinct approaches that they've taken is that they're either developing their own in-house design and manufacturing capabilities, or they are working with more strategic suppliers and creating ecosystems. And as I've said before, they are consolidating their supply chains to work with more strategic suppliers. And retailers are now looking at various implementing and supporting various supplier development interventions. Let's see. Okay, so as I've said, retailers are gaining greater control over their supply chains, either by developing in-house design and manufacturing capabilities, or through working with strategic suppliers. There are two different retailers that I'd like to discuss here. It's the Foschini Group's vertically integrated value chain approach versus Woolworths' supply ecosystem approach. So TFG has focused on building their own in-house design capabilities through the acquisition of manufacturing assets. The retailer, since 2014 to date, has developed or acquired its own manufacturing capabilities in terms of acquiring struggling factories. So they've got they own 5 factories at the moment, mostly based in the Western Cape, and they work with strategic suppliers in KZN that are exclusive suppliers that supply only to those retailers. Investments in upgrading and in factories and in production processes has also been undertaken by the retailer. And then to drive demand for local production, TFG has not only just acquired manufacturing assets, but also other struggling retail outlets. Okay, I will wrap up just now. So there's been quite a lot of investments. I won't really go into Woolworths' approach. It's quite different. They have been working with strategic partners and focused a lot on supplier development, the different initiatives that they've taken. They've got a supplier to supplier mentorship program, and then they've also got an import replacement program that they've focused on. So is reshoring and nearshoring a real possibility? What retailer sourcing strategies have showed us is that retailers are actually being more proactive in terms of supporting local manufacturers. But to what extent? I think a lot of discussions with the retailers has been that, reshoring, nearshoring needs to make commercial sense. And some of the constraints that are stopping this investment or this or nearshoring or reshoring is the missing middle in terms of textile production, which is quite problematic. Another consideration, another thing that has been highlighted is that there are tensions between so do tensions exist between retailers, local and regional sourcing? I think yes, there possibly are tensions. I'll touch on those just a bit later. And then another thing that comes up is, can local manufacturers actually can they meet the demands of retailers? Retailers have additional demands on manufacturers, and can manufacturers actually meet these demands? So I think when we think of the different observations, what comes up is that there's a link between retailer sourcing strategies, industrial and trade policy. And this link actually highlights three core things for me. It's highlighted the shift in policy design. So if you look at the IPAP to the master plan process, the master plan process has consulted quite a great deal of industry actors in terms of the commitments that it outlines. And then the shift from a reactive industrial policy focused on saving a struggling sector versus a proactive targeted industrial policy focused on addressing competitiveness constraints and linking manufacturers to customers or consumers/retailers. And then I think the other thing that these observations in terms of retailer sourcing strategies have highlighted is the importance of a value chain analysis and understanding the tensions between industry actors across the value chains, and how which actor in the value chain can actually unlock opportunities for manufacturing. And then just some policy measures that need to be taken into account. So there's a need for policy measures that actually incentivize investments and create an enabling environment for retailers to own or operate manufacturing assets or develop direct relationships with suppliers. Policy needs to connect inward-focused industrial policy with domestic and regional policies focused on development of competitive regional production networks that can reduce efficiency losses from reshoring and the use of less competitive suppliers. There's a need to increase national and regional cooperation and coordination amongst governments and industry actors in further developing regional value chains in Southern Africa. And there's a need for policy that creates the space for coordination amongst industry actors, trade and industrial policymakers, focused on identifying ways in which regional production networks can be developed. So looking at vertically integrated industrial ecosystems, specifically looking at how regional textile hubs can be developed. There's a need for industrial policy or policies that connect retailers and suppliers from different regions by mapping regional capabilities and identifying the gaps and opportunities for local and regional sourcing. And then I'm nearly there. There's also a need to support and encourage investments in skills development, technology and innovation, and in research and development across the different segments of the value chain. So from fabric production to apparel, and more importantly, I would say the biggest focus should be textile production. And then lastly, based on retailers' sourcing strategies and based on global trends, there's a need to incorporate global trends into creating forward-looking industrial policy, looking at sustainability shift and the development of new fibers and the technologies required for those. Oh yes, I've got a quote that I would say. So just lastly, this quote, there is.
I'm sure we can see. Yeah, I'm sure we can see the quote.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Avenyo. Now we come to our online presenter. That is Elvis. Yeah, thank you very much. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Cornelius. And I want to assure you that I got a memo, so I'll try to stick to time. And my apologies for not being with you in mid-round this morning. You would see also probably from the program that I've sort of adapted the title of the presentation quite slightly to reflect the sort of work we've been doing around critical minerals, and also how African countries can diversify their production processes in ways that they can take advantage of the new waves of the transition technologies that we do see today. And my presentation this morning sort of comes mainly from work myself and Antonio we've been doing for the UNCTAD background paper on economic development for the Africa report that is expected to come out sometime maybe in September or October. That sort of seeks generally to try to examine how, in the process of transitioning to green technologies and green production processes, how African countries can also transition to medium and high-tech value chains by taking advantage of the mineral-led industrialization strategies that we do see emerging across the continent. So I think we've spoken a lot yesterday mainly about sort of the climate change imperative, so I wouldn't dwell much on it. But I think that what the discussions are largely bringing out is the fact that the climate change is still quite disproportional, and its effects are also quite disproportional. And there are several policies, particularly in the case of South Africa, where we do see some development of some policies in ways to mitigate some of the climate change crisis, but also to drive an inclusive process. And I think that one of the key things that also emerging is that in the process of transitioning into greener energy processes, and of course the production processes, we require green technologies, and these green technologies mainly are quite mineral intensive. So this chart simply shows a snapshot, sort of a snapshot of the various critical minerals.
Hello, Elvis.
So the point I was trying to make here is the fact that the green transition requires, or probably it's energy intensive, and this chart simply shows a snapshot of the various critical minerals and the technologies that they're used for. And we do see quite briefly as well, and I'll come back to this later on in the presentation, how African countries are endowed with some of these critical minerals, and this I'll speak to later on. But I think and coming off from the critical minerals, and then also sort of the technologies that they can be used for in terms of the green technologies, I think that's posed a lot of questions around how African countries can integrate into the value chains of some of these fundamental green technologies, and how we can leverage sort of the critical mineral endowment that the continent has in ways that we can also try to capture higher value. And then, of course, this fundamentally brings us to some slides fast around Africa's involvement in global value chains, right? And this is quite well established in the literature, and does highlight the fact that African countries are well integrated into global value chains. But when you decompose some of these engagements in global value chains, we tend to be much engaged in the backward linkages forward linkages instead of backward linkages, where we often tend to supply raw materials that other countries and other companies use elsewhere as intermediate products for their production processes. And then, of course, when we decompose this into the various sectors across the continent, we do see that the forward linkages still dominate across the various manufacturing sectors. And this pertains across different regions as well. And we do see largely as well that when we consider specific high-tech, medium and high-tech industries, these stories still hold, so that African countries are mainly engaged in the forward linkages as to the backward linkages where majority of the value from the value chains are captured. So I think this raises a lot of questions regarding what we can do in ways that African countries, one, can integrate into these various medium and high-tech technology value chains, but as well as how we can use our critical mineral endowment in ways that, in several ways, trying to reverse the resource curse, right? There is a huge literature around the resource curse that probably resource industrialization. And we've seen how some countries, particularly, for instance, Sweden and Finland, have used their mineral resources to industrialize. And why African countries in particular have not been able to follow that sort of development trajectory. And we've seen several cases where our mineral resources have rather been much more of a curse, leading to wars and probably to higher levels of impoverishment rather than improving our welfare systems. So I wouldn't dwell on that. So what I want to touch on briefly and probably provide some additional context is on how much of these critical mineral resources we actually have on the continent, and how we as an African continent we are contributing to the production of this mineral resources. So it's one thing to have the mineral reserves, and it's one thing to be engaged in the production of it. And we do see generally that African countries generally have about, like, let's say for instance, 92% of PGMs in terms of reserves, and this is mainly led by South Africa and probably I think Zimbabwe. And then of course we also do countries, particularly for PGMs, also produce 82% of these critical minerals. And we do see some cases also applying to cobalt. We do see high levels of manganese as well. And then the contribution in terms of production of these critical minerals for cobalt particularly is around 71%. And then of course for manganese is around 66%. I hope you're still with me. Okay, so when one simply just takes a look at the trade data, we do see from the US Geological Service data that we do have some of these minerals on the continent, and we do produce some of these minerals. And when you take a look at trade data as well, what is emerging as well is that across some of these critical minerals, African countries also actually are involved in trading of some of these minerals, and this heat map simply shows some distributions across the different countries. The specific minerals that are emerging in the trade data. What this simply shows is that there are certain countries that are engaged highly in trade of some key critical minerals, and some others are not, but we do see across board that majority of African countries are involved in trading of some of these minerals. But I think one interesting thing that is worth mentioning here is the fact that often cases when you decompose the trade activities of these minerals, you realize that some of these trade activities are mainly in unprocessed raw materials. So what it means is therefore that value addition on these minerals are quite low when you look further into the trade data. And then of course, when you use a very simple network analysis to see the various sort of distributions of trade activities, we do see that particularly South Africa plays a huge role, or probably a central role, in trading of these key minerals, both in terms of trade in the unprocessed resources, but also in some beneficiation activities. And we do see increasingly that what this shows is some level of productive capability that is available on the continent. But of course, these capabilities are often cases quite scattered across different countries. But then, of course, we do know, quite frankly, in order for us to be able to build and probably leverage on some of these endowments and the started opportunities that are emerging, of course, particularly in terms of the productive capabilities, we need to be able to have control of some of these resources. And when you check the distribution or the ownership of some of these mines, particularly across the African country, and who owns the production of them, you would realize that we majority of them are still owned by Anglo-American, and that of course questions then how much opportunities African countries can take in terms of trying to leverage some of these minerals, given that we don't naturally even own some of these mines and some of the productions that occur in these mines. And then also quite briefly is the fact that we do not own the mines and we do not own some of the production of these minerals. And also one extra layer is the fact that processing of these minerals, majority of them also happen outside of the continent. And a quick look at this chart shows the majority of them happens in China. And of course, you would realize some of these discussions also in the media these days around NATO and other Western countries identifying China as the main strategic how do you call it, risk, right? Because there is a high level of concentration in the processing of some of these minerals in China. But of course, when we look particularly at cobalt, and I think that the story that I've already emphasized also comes up quickly, particularly in the case of South Africa, where we do see that South Africa, though they don't necessarily produce large quantities of cobalt, I don't think we even see it coming to in the trade data. What we do see is South Africa does have some productive capabilities in adding value and beneficiating some of the critical minerals, particularly for industrial purposes. So then several questions come to mind in terms of how African countries can claim ownership of some of these mineral resources and use them to diversify some of their production processes. And then of course, these mainly based on work that Antonio and someone have done, identifies two main perspectives, right? One being the GVC perspective, that simply identifies African countries being able to move from the upstream segments of the value chain in some of these minerals to much more downstream segments of the value chain where they can capture some value. But one criticism of the GVC perspective is the fact that it does not necessarily indicate how some of these mineral resources and the industries in which they occur link to other downstream sectors or industries necessarily. So an alternative perspective is the structural transformation perspective, where we do see how interlinked some of these various manufacturing industries are, particularly, for instance, how the chemical industry, which produces fertilizers, can be leveraged for agricultural food value chain, and then of course some of the biofuels that are produced in the agricultural value chain could be used in the green energy value chain, for instance. And then of course some of these interlinkages try to generate much more higher multiplier effect, and then we can sort of in several other ways try to leverage some of this some of the beneficiating activities for a more diversified for a more diversified continent. So what we did, and I hope I'm doing well with time, is to look at some diversification strategies, particularly across the continent, for specific countries that we do see having the potential and the productive capability and the foundational capabilities to, one, develop some of these value chains that are required on the continent, but also...
Hello, Elvis. Elvis, can you try to wrap up, please?
Yes, I'm wrapping up now. So we did three main case studies of some countries that have the foundational capabilities to lead some of the value chains that I've been speaking to, but also they have developed over time some of the foundational capabilities to do so, and based on their activities across different sectors, but as well as their export baskets of some of these mineral resources. For instance, we've identified South Africa to have some comparative advantage in the EV sort of battery productions, and also, of course, based on its huge experience in the mining industry, some production of some of the mining equipment that South Africa is well endowed with. And of course, one other case study we conducted is the case of Morocco, where we emphasize their role in the production of the solar battery and technologies. And of course, one last one is the case of DRC. And this particular case is quite different because DRC mainly produce some of these mineral resources. And one of the cases, and probably an argument we try to make in the paper is simply to, in this particular case, develop some regional value chains around the manufacturing, the translation of some of the minerals that are used in the production of mobile technologies into manufacturing processes that necessarily do not have the market in DRC, but the East African market can serve as sort of a driver and for the mobile technologies. And to conclude quite quickly, Cornelius, is the fact that what is emerging is a key role Africa can play in the techno energy paradigm. But of course, this comes with a lot of opportunities, but as well as challenges, right? And one key challenge we try to emphasize is the need for African countries to strategically strategically build global alliances that are in the interest of the continent, but also trying in several other ways to reduce private rents and conditions in several ways that are not beneficial to the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elvis. Thank you for agreeing to be rushed. I think you did a very good job at that. Right. So now it's time for questions. I'm sure we've been jotting down the questions, and I was given a note that we should try to make sure that this one ends at 11, and that is we'll see. But let's just see how it goes. Let's take the first round of questions. When you raise a question, introduce yourself, indicate who among the presenters the question is directed to. I have one hand here, two at the back, and here just in front. So let's take 3 now, and then I will come back to you. Where is the mic? Or is it at the back? Okay. Okay. Yes, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name is Kabila. I'm with the School of Economics in Northwest University. My question is to Elvis, and second question to Mtati Vuyiswa. First of all, in your case study between the various countries, I wanted to find out which of the policy, which was more important in those countries, the SMH policy or the manufacturing policy, especially in the case study examples that you drew. To be able to see.
The first question is to Elvis.
No. First question is the Odwa.
Okay,
sorry, I was pointing at him and reading the name tag in front of him. So I wanted to establish from your perspective, which in those countries, what drove what? Did SMEs drive manufacturing, or was there already an established manufacturing culture base capability that the SMEs sort of blocked into? My second question for you is, the lack of financing has been a challenge for SMEs for as far as we can remember doing research on SMEs. Is there anything you reckon could be done to change that? My question to Elvis is, thank you for your presentation on the climbing a global value chain. I see the recommendations you made about the possible route for backward and forward linkages in the 3 African countries. Did your study take into account existing capabilities, technology intensity? Did you look at, in the case of South Africa, do they have the existing ability to flow into battery production? In the case of DRC, into the production of the cell phone components that you that you talk about? And if not, how do you accede to the recommendations you make? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. My name is San Mbakalo, next in Mandela School of Public Governance, UCT. So my question is to Vuyiswa. My question is trade restriction and quota and the policy that was introduced for the T&A. Do you know if there was any evaluation done after the 2 years, or it just fizzled away after the 2 years? And would you have recommended that while the quota system is introduced for the local sourcing of local material, support should have been given to the domestic manufacturers to scale up, or it would have just been, okay, let's try this out, and if it doesn't work, we just close it and just move on to something else? What would you have recommended? It's two questions I asked. Was there an evaluation after the 2 years quota system? Would you have said why the quota system was given, support should have been given to local manufacturers to scale up? Because restriction most times does not give the finance, but I want to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Mohammed Patel from TIPS. My question is for Mohau. I hope and sorry, earlier I was giving you the tissue, not because you had an issue, it was just to make you more comfortable, that's all. So my question relates to your econometric model, right? So you have your dependent variable as manufacturing growth, and you listed all of the independent variables and their statistical significance. I just want to understand, do you consider the proportion of fossil fuels, or more specifically, the proportion of coal in the energy mix, as a potential variable impacting manufacturing growth moving on into the future? And the reason I ask this is because we're increasingly seeing a global environment averse towards coal investments and coal-based generation, and there's increasing pressure on countries like South Africa that are highly invested in coal to migrate away from that. So my understanding would be it is likely that countries that persist with the fossil fuel intensive energy system are likely to face manufacturing growth and investment constraints moving forward. So that was the rationale. Is that a variable that you considered? And yeah, I just want to know your opinion on that. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, let's try to get answers here before we move to the next round. I will start with you, Elvis. Are you still with us? Did you get the question that was directed to you?
Yes. Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, yes. One question from Kabila around the routes for diversification, and if the countries that we examined for our case studies has existing capabilities. A short answer from me is yes. Because when you look into the trade data, often cases we do see, and then of course you merge the trade data, particularly from ERA to Bachi, you'd see that there are cases where some of these African countries that we examined export sort of processed materials or processed products. What that indicates to us is that there is some beneficiation activity going on. And that also means that there is some foundational capability that could be used to develop some of these value chains. So then, if you ask me what the policy recommendation could be, is the fact, and I think the Morocco case also often cases presents a very good example of how they have over time developed some capabilities in the production of some of the CSPs, but also even in the auto industry, right? And if you study the industrial policy that they use, is largely about integrating the various types of policies that that we are calling industrial policy. So simply, one of the recommendations we make is for some of these other countries that are looking forward to developing some of these value chains, or probably integrating some of these value chains, trying in several ways to integrate their industrial policies in ways that afford them the ability to be able to produce or probably build some of these foundational capabilities needed to add value and probably capture value in some of these value chains.
Thank you, Elvis. So yeah, you can start. All of you have questions.
Thank you, Sand, for your question. In terms of the input quotas, those import quotas were specifically for Chinese products. And what happened is that it was allocated for 2 years. So 2007 was implemented for 2 years with the intention of actually assisting manufacturers to have the space within those 2 years to build up their capabilities. But those quotas were implemented without any industrial policy to support, or any policies really to support building up capabilities. So what we saw is that despite the quotas being implemented, retailers actually just diverted their sourcing and sourced from other regions and didn't source locally. And they didn't source locally because they didn't have the availability of products in the country to actually meet retailers' demands. So imports didn't decrease. So after the 2 years, I'm not quite sure, but there was an evaluation in terms of the fact that the imports didn't decrease, and there was also a lot of tension and a lot of criticism of the fact that you can't just use trade policy to assist industrial development, and even if you're giving the manufacturers the space to actually be competitive, if you're not putting the right processes in place or the right policies in place, then it defeats the purpose. So what came up is that in 2010, then there was the competitiveness clothing and textile competitiveness program that was implemented, which then started really targeting competitiveness and looking at certain incentives that can be given to manufacturers to actually build up their capabilities. But the textile and apparel manufacturing sector was built under import substitution, highly protected. So when we opened up our borders, it was a sector that was not efficient and couldn't compete. And in the mid-90s to early 2000s, what we saw is that there was a lot of initiatives from government to just protect, but not build up capabilities. And then from 2010 onwards, we see a shift where there's an understanding that, you know what, we need to build up capabilities, and we also need to, since the market is now structurally locked into the domestic market in terms of manufacturers, are locked into producing for the local market. They don't have export capabilities. What does this mean? You know, it means that we need to link our manufacturers to the domestic retailers. And what are the requirements of domestic retailers to actually source locally? So then there were those kind of discussions and initiatives that were put into place to kind of build up the local competitiveness.
Oh, thanks, Mohammed. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the tissues. I wish I could apologize for my sinuses, but I can't. I think they are just here. Maybe I should move to the coast. As soon as I get to Johannesburg, it's always an issue for me for the first 2 days. In terms of the variables, yes, indeed, I considered. I considered there is CO2 emissions. I considered the coal rent. I considered it's just that I must admit, you know, you're playing with what you have at the moment, and you're still questioning. Like I said in my earlier statement, that it's an explorative study. I'm still exploring, and if you pose such a question, I know that I should also relook at, because I'm looking at there is variables in terms of renewable energy as well as alternative energy. So I should be exploring those as well. So thanks.
Thank you very much. So if you take South Africa and Vietnam in 2001 had a economic strategy specifically regarding the inclusion of small firms in their value chains. South Africa 2 years later had an integrated strategy on promotion of entrepreneurship and small enterprises. So in terms of the playing fields, from a policy point of view, you know, it's level. Where the fundamental difference is on its implementation. So if you take the examples made by Vuyiswa on retail, how manufacturers have been searching for countries in which they could produce for far less, you know, indicates, you know, something else. DTIC has a policy in one of the IPEP instruments. It has a policy on localization. people were applying for exemption from compliance. And DTIC had to go on and try and close those gaps by introducing measures that promoted, the manufacturing within the country itself. So the point is that the instruments are there. That's not the question, but it is how, both from the government perspective as well as from the private sector, they're engaging with those instruments. Others are quite evasive around that. Now, if you take the question of finance for SMEs, it has always been raised as a primary challenge. Now, how the South African state functions is very difficult, because there's a lack of coordination and placing in a central place where you know that so and so is in the lead. Before a time, small business activities were at DTIC. You then split it and then took small business and placed them elsewhere. And it takes, let's say, about 2 to 3 years to set up that government department. So you have got these gaps in your system that do not allow for you to address the fundamentals. So it is important that we don't only look at the policy level, but at the implementation and the execution of such. So the National Development Plan places a great emphasis on the development of a capable state. Now, a capable state assumes inherent in it that there's a conformity and uniformity of how people execute things. But I can tell you, one official in Pretoria will interpret a policy instrument in a particular way, and you go to KZN, it's the same instrument, but people are interpreting it in. And then, I don't want to get into a political terrain.
Yeah, I think, we just,
Yes.
can we just
Yes.
quickly.
I think the point is that you also have a business fraternity that does not always like to conform, to things, in which they always take the shortest route without always understanding the price to pay, in the long run.
Okay.
I do apologize.
Thank you. Can we, both the questions and the responses, can we make it, but just to allow our online participants to raise the question. I see a hand. Michael Khan, would you please go ahead?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Just to introduce myself, I work in the field of innovation policy, locally and internationally. I've got 3 things to add in. The first is how much I enjoyed Vuyiswa's presentation on the textile industry. It's a great example of innovation pressure and the way firms deal with this incrementally. And it's something that we really can learn a lot from. The same case illustrates the importance of radical innovation or disruptive innovation in the form of regulation, which is something we often forget about, and it's very important. The second is an observation regarding the econometric modeling presentation. The whole issue of electrification and industrialization is as old as electricity itself, or generated electricity. So the Leninists understood it perfectly, the Stalinists understood it perfectly, and in the 1920s, the most electrified industry was already in Japan. So there's a lot to learn from this, from these comparative examples. And that takes me to the first presentation, the comparative studies. What worries me about all of the presentations I've heard over the last 2 days is how little engagement there is with the reality of organized labor. It's the big elephant in the room, and we can't pretend it away. So I go to that presentation where there was use was made in the comparisons of GDP per capita, and mention is made also of unemployment. Now, in my own recent studies, the factor that I think has to be looked at very critically is not GDP per capita, but instead the average wage. The average wage expressed in PPP dollars, because that contains enormous significance for us in South Africa. If you compare our average wage in PPP dollars, I could put it to the room. What is the number? Does anyone know? If I tell you that in Malaysia, it's 15,000 PPP, what is our level? It turns out our level is identical with the UK. It's $44,000 PPP. Now, what does that tell you about the cost of labor? And please don't let us pretend that this is entirely due to top management. It goes right across. We are a very, very expensive place to do business for all the reasons that have been mentioned so far. So in the modeling, perhaps we can include, instead of GDP per capita, the average wage, and see what that tells us about the incredible difficulties we face in growing our country and in building the capable state. And thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. I think on that note, on those very, very useful comments, I have been told that they've been patient with me, but their patience is now run out. I've been told that we now have to end here. The presenters are still here, and for those that are online, I'm sure if you also look at the details on their biographs, you can also see their contact details. You can also send questions directly to them. And please, next is the tea break, strictly 15 minutes. And I wish good luck to the upcoming moderators. Hopefully you are going to do a better job than me. Thank you very much, everyone. And goodbye from me now. I have a flight to catch. Thank you so much. I wish you all the deliberations.